Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, well, welcome back, everybody. Another episode of The Examined Life. I sincerely hope I still have a few people listening after last week's episode, because I'm pretty well convinced that probably ticked a few people off. So, anyhow, this week I'll be talking about something that I'm going to term narrative bias, and that's going to build on a couple of things I mentioned last week. But before I do that, let me just get right into the facepalm and sigh award of the week. Now, I didn't do one of these last week. Hadn't been following the news as well, or just hadn't seen anything that was, I don't know, obviously a bad argument. There are still lots of people making ridiculous, dumb, and pretty stupid claims in the news, but I've found that many of them are just asserting it flat out, not even bothering to argue for it, and just saying things that are flat out untrue. So I can't really give them a facepalm and sigh award for making a bad argument when they're not even bothering to make an argument. Maybe I should come up with a new segment for that, but oh well, I'll try and think about that. Anyhow, the award this week goes out to an actor named John Fugelsang, and I looked him up on IMDb. He actually hasn't been in a whole lot of things. I guess he's best known for being in a movie from about 15 or 20 years ago called Coyote Ugly, and another one called The Girl on the Train or something like that. So anyhow, this exchange had happened in Twitter. I'll just give you the details and then explain why he made such a bad argument. So, President Trump tweeted out, numerous states introducing Bible literary classes, giving students the option of studying the Bible. Starting to make a turn back? Great. And unsurprisingly, when President Trump tweets something, it gets controversial. So this guy, John Fugelsang, responded, "The only reason you're president is that 62 million self-described Christians were completely illiterate about Jesus' teachings. Every time Trump mentions the Bible, an angel coughs up blood." Well, that's not very kind. Now, I don't have Twitter, so I'm only going by the reports of what other people have said, but apparently this actor is kind of a left-wing guy, so unsurprisingly, a lot of people gave him support and encouragement. But one guy did call him out on this, saying, and this guy's name was Larry Ferguson. He said, "Self-described comedian and at John Fugelsang wants to be the nation's authority on Christianity, so voting Hillary is following Christ's teachings? If you knew Jesus' teachings, you'd know politicians haven't followed them. We voted for a POTUS, not a pastor. Your Twitter Bible study is a fail." And to that, John Fugelsang replied, "Please name one teaching of Christ Trump campaigned on or fought for legislatively. One. I can name you dozens that you've rejected by supporting DT. You only have to name one, just one. This will involve actually reading the Gospels." Well, I've never met either of these people. I've obviously never met this actor, so I don't know if he's actually read the Gospels or not, but I do seem to recall Christ's words in the Sermon on the Mount that said something along the lines of, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will see God." And I don't think he's following those words of Christ. So if he has read the Gospels, he may need to go back and reread them. But anyhow, that's not really the point. The reason why he gets my facepalm and sigh award of the week is because he didn't really respond to what Larry Ferguson was claiming there. Now, what Larry Ferguson claimed is, we voted for a POTUS, not a pastor. That means he's saying, well, I have a different standard for what I want in a president than I do for what I want in a pastor. I've heard other people make similar claims in regards to President Trump. And you can disagree with that. We can argue about that. That's possibly a legitimate distinction to make. Maybe it's not. That's a point that's actually very worth discussion and gets into a lot of good ethical theory. But the trouble here is that Fugelsang just completely missed that. His response was to say, well, what are the teachings of Christ that Trump's trying to get through legislatively? When what Larry Ferguson was saying is, well, I have a different standard. I'm not going to apply the same standard to my pastor, or to my fellow followers of Christ, to other Christians, as I'm going to apply to somebody who I want to be the president. So Fogelson didn't even address what Larry Ferguson's response was. And if you're having a hard time seeing this distinction, here's an analogy to help you grasp it. Let's suppose that when you're a teenager, you're bringing home a date that you're going to take to the prom to meet your parents. And your parents meet her and don't like her, or I guess if you're a girl, meet him and don't like him. And they're going through all these reasons as to why this person is bad for you, why they drag you down, and so on and so forth. And maybe they're even giving you, like, good legitimate reasons, like, say, they know this particular girl has a bad reputation that's well-earned, she's been in and out of jail. A whole number of reasons that parents would not want you to date this person, at least some of which, let's just say for the sake of argument, are legitimate. And so you sit there and listen to your parents go on and on about this, and your response is, Mom, Dad, look, I'm not looking to date this person. I just need somebody to go to the prom with tonight. I have no intention of dating them or hanging out with them again after tonight. This is just a one-time deal because I need somebody to go to the prom with me. And in response to that, your parents just start saying the same things over again. This person is bad for you. She's going to drag you down. She's been in and out of jail. She has a bad reputation. On and on they go. Oh, well, your parents didn't actually address what you said there. All they did was keep repeating their same things. They either didn't grasp what was going on, or they just didn't care. And that's exactly what happened in this exchange on Twitter. Fogelson either didn't grasp what the other guy's point was, that there's a distinction between the standard I have for president and the standard I have for pastor, or he just didn't care. He's so wrapped up in hatred of President Trump that he just can't figure it out. Now, I can also give you one example of something President Trump has done legislatively that is more in keeping with Christ's teachings, in that Christ said if anyone does anything to lead one of these little ones astray, does something malicious or horrible to a child, it would be better for them to have a millstone put around their neck and thrown into the sea than it is for what's coming for them, i.e., if you mess with the kids, it's not going to go well for you. Well, President Trump has nominated conservative justices of the Supreme Court who are far more likely to overturn abortion, which is the murder of little children in the womb, and thus that's a way he's sort of in keeping with Christ's teachings. And now that's not to say that President Trump hasn't said and done a lot of stuff that isn't in keeping with Christ's teachings. He certainly has. And if Fogelson had just made the point of saying something like, hey, why do you Christians vote for somebody who doesn't act very Christian? Well, that would be kind of a legitimate line of inquiry. Maybe something could actually be gained from that. But instead, he just has to go on a rant and say that Christians are illiterate of their own religion, and that's why they voted for Trump, when plainly he doesn't understand at all what the counter-arguments are being made. And on top of that, when you actually read Christ's teachings, it's not as though he's talked about what type of government you should have, or who you should vote for, or what principles you should look for in the leader of your government. He just didn't really address any of that. Christ was very unconcerned, it seems, with government and politics, at least in the teachings we have of him in the Gospels anyway. So Fogelson's response here was a complete non sequitur in that it doesn't even connect with what Larry Ferguson was saying to him. And this may be a little bit of a tangent here, but there's an important thing going on here, which is when we as human beings reason, we are all the time making distinctions. We're making distinctions that are sometimes appropriate and good and sometimes that are wrong. We distinguish between things all the time. That's what my example of the bringing a bad date to your parents, but it's only for the prom was about. If in that example you were making the distinction between, well, this isn't somebody I'm dating, this is just a one-night deal, one thing for just the prom. So you're making a distinction there, and your parents were refusing to recognize that distinction. Likewise, in this example, Larry Ferguson was trying to make a distinction between what his standard would be for the President of the U.S. and what his standard would be for a pastor. And Fogelson just responded with a complete non sequitur where he ignored this distinction that Ferguson was making. And I've heard some people argue that you shouldn't make a distinction between what your standard is for the president and what it is for your pastor. And maybe that should be the case. Maybe that's a good thing to talk about. But Fogelson didn't do that. He just completely failed to understand this and gave a non sequitur. And so for giving a non sequitur, showing that he doesn't understand what the counterargument is, and for appealing to Christ's teachings while simultaneously failing to follow his Christ's teaching to be a peacemaker, I'm giving Fogelson the facepalm and sigh award of the week here. Alright, so on to talking about narrative bias. Now, loosely speaking, narrative bias is when you let the story that you want to see affect what you see, therefore you don't see things that conflict with the story or narrative you want to see. So to illustrate this, I'm going to tell two little stories here and then give some practical data. So the first story is, and I remember this one because I got taken in by it. In fact, both of these are stories that I got taken in by for a little while at least. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a story that started making the rounds on the internet that an Italian expert was studying a first-century document written by the Roman historian Marcus Vallis Patroclus. And again, I'm just horrible at pronouncing ancient names. I'm sure I'm butchering that. Anyhow, the story was he was poking around the Vatican's archives, and he found a record of this Roman historian recording a miracle by someone that his name was loosely a lot like Jesus of Nazareth. The story went that the text as a whole was a narrative of the author's return journey from Parthia to Rome in about 31 AD, and supposedly the part of the text that caught this expert's eye was an episode taking place in the city of Sebaste, or that would be now in the West Bank. And the author describes a great leader of the town with a group of disciples and followers, causing many of the lower-class people from neighboring villages to gather around him. According to the Roman historian, the great man's name was Isos de Nazaris, a Greco-Latin translation of Jesus' Hebrew name, Yeshua. Then, upon entering the town, Jesus visited the house of a woman who had just given birth to a stillborn child. Jesus picked up the dead child and uttered a prayer in Aramaic to the heavens, which unfortunately the author describes as incomprehensible, and to the crowd's surprise and amazement, the baby came back to life immediately. Again, according to this article that was making the rounds, many texts and analysis had been conducted to confirm the authenticity of the text, which had only recently been discovered in the Vatican's archives. And they say, according to the article, that the parchment, the ink, literary style, and handwriting had all been scrutinized and were entirely legitimate, and that the sheepskin parchment it was written on was dated to roughly 20 to 45 AD. So the story was, hey, here we have a non-Christian pagan source confirming an account of Christ performing miracles. And on top of that, it's not later, it's contemporaneous, because you do actually have non-Christian sources that talk about Christ performing miracles. Jewish accounts that come later, after Christ, attempt to debunk him, will flat out admit he was a miracle worker of some kind, and then they just turn around and claim it was from the devil or satanic rather than divine. But those aren't contemporaneous with Christ, they come after the fact. So it would be pretty significant to have a contemporaneous account of Christ performing miracles. The problem is, it turns out that this was a completely fake story that somebody made up and put on a website that published fake news. And this was back in 2014, so it was before fake news was considered a big thing that everybody talked about. And so it took in a lot of people, even people who were well educated on this subject, saw this and thought, oh, this could be something. And part of the reason why it took people in is that the details in the story seem to match, well, what we would expect to find if something like this ever happened. Ancient documents are routinely found in old libraries, universities, and monasteries and things along those lines that were just misfiled and people forgot about. So it really wouldn't be all that surprising if somebody was poking around the Vatican's archives and found some document that somebody else had misfiled hundreds of years ago and they'd forgotten about, or something similar to that. Further, if you already believe that Christ is a miracle worker, you're going to think, well, of course, why wouldn't there be a record of it? So it was a fake story that took a lot of people in, and I was taken in by it myself for a few days until I realized that it was just a fake story that somebody made up. Second story example is that in late 2011, the manuscript scholar Scott Carroll was working for the organization that would soon become the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. He tweeted out an announcement that he'd found the earliest known manuscript of the New Testament from the Gospel of Mark, and that it dated to the 1st century A.D. Then in 2012, Daniel B. Wallace, who is the senior research professor of the New Testament at the Dallas Theological Seminary, he confirmed Carroll's statement. And Wallace is not only the senior research professor there, he's also one of the editors of the Net Bible. He's a pretty exceptional biblical scholar who knows what he's talking about, an expert in this if there is one. Further, in a debate around that same time with Bart Ehrman, Wallace reported that that fragment also dated to the 1st century. So this would have been very significant if it had come to pass, because any Christian text that was written earlier than 200 AD is a rare and remarkable find. There are some, but they're very, very scarce, and there's none that have ever been found that date to before 100 AD. And on top of that, manuscripts or early manuscript fragments of the Gospel of Mark are especially scarce. So if you did have a 1st century manuscript of Mark, that would be the earliest manuscript or fragment of the New Testament to survive from antiquity, written probably within only 40 years of when the original was composed. So that'd be a pretty big bombshell in New Testament scholarship, and it would go a long way to helping us argue for the veracity of the New Testament. Now, they'd said at the time, Wallace and I think Gary Habermas talked about this too, and Carroll, they all said that it would be published at some point, and that was 6 years. 6 years went by, and it never was. And people kept wondering, well, if you have this incredible find, why isn't it getting published? Let's get it out there. Let's have people look at it. Well, time went by, and eventually it was published. And it turns out it was an early fragment of the Gospel of Mark, but it probably dated to within 150 to 200 AD. So, very important, still probably the earliest fragment of the Gospel of Mark in existence, but not quite the so early it's in the 1st century AD that everyone was going around claiming for 6 years. Now, you found out later that Dan Wallace had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, so he couldn't say anything, even though he found out later that it wasn't from the 1st century AD, and a few other people were deceived. But anyhow, this rumor had been going around in Christian apologetic circles for 5-6 years that there was a 1st century fragment of the Gospel of Mark, and we were going to hear about it any day now. And finally it comes out, and it's a good find. It's important. It's pretty useful because you look at that fragment that they have there, and there's no significant variance of it. It matches the text of Mark we already have, so that means probably the Gospel of Mark wasn't really changed in 150 to 200 AD, so that's something, even if it's not before 100 AD. But now, why was it that everybody kind of latched onto this story? There was no real evidence. Nobody'd seen the manuscript except a few people who were very tight-lipped about it and didn't say anything other than they'd seen it. So why did that get latched onto like that? I was even taken in by it and was talking to people about it and discussing it, and so were many other people. And now I'd like you to keep those two stories in mind as I read you some more objective facts to help us kind of make sense of this. And here I'm going to be quoting from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, because he summarized these experiments I'm going to be talking about pretty succinctly, and it's just easier to quote him than it is to try to come up with my own summary. So, Daniel Simmons was a psychologist who about 15 years ago did some experiments in cognitive abilities in what we see. Simmons was investigating something called sustained inattentional blindness. He would sit his research subjects in front of a video monitor and show them, for example, a field of wheat. Then he would transform the photo slowly, secretly, while they watched. He would slowly fade in a road cutting through the wheat. He didn't insert some little easy-to-miss footpath either. It was a major trail, occupying a good third of the image. Remarkably, the observers would frequently fail to take notice. The demonstration that made Dr. Simmons famous was of the same kind, but more dramatic, even unbelievable. First, he produced a video of two teams of 3 people. One team was wearing white shirts, the other black. The 2 teams were not off in the distance either, or in any way difficult to see. The 6 of them filled much of the video screen, and their facial features were close enough to see clearly. Each team had its own ball, which they bounced or threw to their other team members as they moved and fainted in the small space in front of the elevators where the game was filmed. Once Dan had his video, he showed it to his study participants. He asked each of them to count the number of times the white shirts threw the ball back and forth to one another. After a few minutes, his subjects were asked to report the number of passes. Most answered 15. That was the correct answer. Most felt pretty good about that. Ha! They passed the test. But then Dr. Simmons asked, "Did you see the gorilla?" Was this a joke? What gorilla? So we said, watch the video again, but this time don't count. Sure enough, a minute or so in, a man dressed in a gorilla suit waltzes right into the middle of the game for a few long seconds, stops, and then beats his chest in the manner of stereotyped gorillas everywhere. Right in the middle of the screen, large as life, painfully and irrefutably evident. But 1 out of every 2 of his research subjects missed it, the first time they saw the video. It gets worse. Dr. Simmons did another study. This time he showed his subjects a video of someone being served at a counter. The server dips behind the counter to retrieve something, then pops back up. So what? Most of his participants didn't detect anything amiss. But it was a different person who stood up in the original server's place. No way, you think, I'd notice. But it's a yes way. There's a high probability you wouldn't detect the change, even if the gender or race of the person is switched at the same time. You're blind too. This is partially because vision is expensive. Psychologically expensive, neurologically expensive. Very little of your retina is high resolution and fava. The very central, high-resolution part of the eye used to do such things as identify faces. Each of these scarce cells needs 10,000 cells in the visual cortex merely to manage the first part of the multi-stage process of seeing. Then each of those 10,000 requires 10,000 more just to get to stage 2. If all of your retina was high resolution, you would require the skull of a B-movie alien to house your brain. In consequence, we triage when we see. Most of our vision is peripheral and low vision. We save the high resolution for things of importance. We point our high resolution capacities at the few specific things we are aiming at, and we let everything else, which is almost everything, fade unnoticed into the background. And I do believe Dr. Simmons' experiments have been replicated in other conditions. People have done similar experiments, and the results tend to come up pretty much the same. For most people, most of the time, if we're focusing on something, we're going to miss most everything else that's going on around us. And now you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with those 2 stories? How does this affect narrative bias? What's going on? And the answer is that, well, at least to some degree, we're all biologically contained creatures. That is, we do use our bodies, and the way our bodies interact with the world does actually affect how we perceive things, just obviously. And if I didn't have eyes, I wouldn't be able to see, and how I see definitely affects how I perceive the world. And you can even see that in just how we use language. We'll actually use the word see interchangeably, meaning I physically observe something with my eyes, as well as I think, in that I might say, I see your point, which means I perceive your point with my mind, not that I saw your point with my eyes. We use the word interchangeably like that. So my point here is that just as when you focus on something with your eyes, you're likely to miss a lot of other details, even if they're weird, wacky, and things that you think you should notice, when you focus on something with your mind, and you really, really focus, it's also quite likely that you're going to miss a bunch of other details, that even ones that are important and are weird or wacky, that you probably think you should notice. And that's generally why, when people are, say, at one extreme end of a spectrum, they can't see that they are, because they're so focused that they can't see the error going on around them. For example, in last week's episode, I argued that a culture that's way too masculine will never talk about things like toxic masculinity, because that's not how that type of error works. If you're way too far into one extreme, well, it's going to be very, very hard for you to realize that you're way, way too far to one extreme. Because if you're so hyper-focused, too hyper-focused on masculinity, you're not going to see the problems that entails, because that's where your focus is. You're not going to see the things that seem like peripheral details to you, even though those peripheral details often become very, very important. So, in the two stories I told before, for example, well, I do believe that Christ was a miracle worker and was the Son of God. So, when somebody says, hey, we found more evidence of that, even though I tend to be a skeptical person by nature due to my philosophical training, I'm still more inclined to believe that. And fortunately, I didn't go sharing that article with a bunch of people. I found out relatively quickly. But I also didn't immediately take a skeptical stance like I probably should have, because it turned out to be completely fake. And the reason why I probably didn't immediately start off with a very skeptical stance is that, well, since I do believe that Christ was the Son of God, that he was a miracle worker, that he died and rose again on the third day, why would I question something that says that? Why would I question more evidence in favor of what I already think? It just isn't something people would normally do. Because, since I'm focused on that story, that narrative, since that's what I already believe, why would I look for peripheral details like that? And it was a similar thing to a lesser degree with that story of the fragment of the Gospel of Mark maybe being from the 1st century A.D. A lot of people wanted to think that was the case for some very, very good reasons, and we had experts telling us that that was probably the case, even though how tight-lipped some of them were about it should have made us suspicious, so a lot of people bought into that, because why wouldn't they? That's the way myself and many other people already thought about these things, so why wouldn't we just naturally say, well, of course they're eventually going to find a first century copy of the Gospel of Mark or something else from the New Testament. It was around then. Why wouldn't they? Now, I picked these examples because they were quick, easy, and personal. They were things that I'd got taken in by in the past that I only later realized I was wrong about. Neither of these stories should give you any cause to doubt the veracity of the New Testament. If you want any more information about that, why we can trust the New Testament, why it almost certainly tells us what's true, go back and listen to episode 7, where I talked about some reasons why we could trust that the Christmas story, the Gospels report, are true, because I talk about that a little bit in there. Now, once you take this tendency that we all have to focus not just our sight, but our mind on things, and combine it with the fact that we all tend to live in our narrative, that is, we all have a story about who we are, what we're doing, and what we're doing in life, what the purpose of life is, that's when you wind up with narrative bias. And what I mean, I'm speaking in a very broad sense about narrative and story here. That's interchangeable probably with the term worldview here. What I just mean by that is we all think of ourselves kind of as the hero of our own story, and why wouldn't you? That's generally a pretty good thing. We all see ourselves that way. We all have a story we tell ourselves about why we get up in the morning, what gives us meaning. And I don't mean a story that we tell ourselves in like a bad way or a self-deceiving way. That's just the way as human beings we make sense of the world around us, is we tell our stories. It's similar to how when we see things, we tend to not perceive them so much as they are, but as how they're useful to us. And here, what I mean by that is, when I see a coffee cup, I don't see a ceramic piece of material that has a certain shape. I see a coffee cup that I can drink coffee out of. That's because my mind and myself, how I work, I'm looking at it, discerning its purpose, assigning the purpose to it, and I see a coffee cup rather than a chunk of ceramic. In fact, typically, if you see something and you don't know what it is, you immediately will try and assign purpose to it. You're going to try and figure out, well, what's that for? Most of the time, at least if that's what you're focused on. if you're not focused on it, you probably won't even think about it. And that's because, as human beings, we're creatures that crave and make meaning. We look at the world and find meaning in it. Sometimes we do it right, sometimes we do it wrong. My daughter's not even 3 yet, and she's constantly going around asking us what things are and what they're used for, because she's looking for what the meaning of things are. She doesn't want to know the chemical content of things or their atomic structures. She wants to know, well, is that a pen? Is it useful? Can I write with it? Can I color with that? Is it something I can eat? Is it something that's going to hurt me? Basic things like that. And that's, at a very basic level, how we actually perceive the world. And we do it so innately that we usually don't realize we're doing it. And from that, loosely speaking, we build stories that we tell ourselves about the world. We build our narrative. So, just broad strokes, my narrative is that I'm a follower of Christ, a husband, a father, and a philosopher, and I really like coffee, I really enjoy good stories, I really enjoy a good game, and I'd like to, one day before I die, taste some 50-year-old scotch. And so that's a part of the narrative, the story that I tell myself. And if you stop and think about it, you're going to realize, well, you do the same thing as well. And some of the details of the stories we tell ourselves are going to be right, some are going to be wrong. Very rarely are we as good as we think we are. Sometimes we think we're the hero of a story when we've deceived ourselves and we're actually the villain. That's why you want to have some self-awareness, so you can realize what's gone wrong, if there's something going wrong. And that's also why you want to have a community of close friends and family around you, so that when you start going wrong and you're telling yourself a story about yourself and the world that's wrong, they can kind of walk up and slap you in the head and say, no, that's wrong, get with it, this is the way reality really is. So what narrative bias is it's where you get so focused on your own narrative that you don't see the peripheral details going on, which actually sometimes would conflict with the narrative you're telling yourself and should make you question that narrative and maybe rethink the whole thing. So here are 2 other quick examples I've come across. My wife and I watched that Netflix documentary, Making a Murderer, both seasons, both the first one and the second one, and we found it pretty compelling, interesting. It's if you like true crime stuff, it's probably worth your time. But after the first season, I did some research. A lot of people did research on that, and I found out that the documentary filmmakers who made that first season deceived everyone. That is, they distorted what was going on there. The easiest example I can remember is, if you've seen this, you'll know what I'm talking about. There's a big point in when they're doing discovery before the trial where they find a vial of Stephen Avery's blood, and there's a little hole in it, and the seal that it had been in had been broken. And so, well, the filmmakers lead you to believe somebody cut this open, took out his blood, and planted it. And that's been his whole contention, is that he was framed. Well, what the filmmakers didn't tell you is that little hole was supposed to be there. Because if you go give blood, say, at your doctor's office or something, they put a needle into you, and they have a little vial at the end of it. Well, there's a little hole that the needle goes into, and the blood goes into the vial through that little hole, and that's what that little hole was. It wasn't there because somebody broke a seal, shoved a needle in there and drew out blood. That's normal. That's the way something like that is supposed to be. And obviously the filmmakers had to know that, or if they didn't know it, they should have. That was never brought up again at the trial that came later, because I'm sure his attorneys did their research and realized, oh, well, this doesn't help us, so we're not going to bring it up. And I found many other things that was like that, where the filmmakers, the directors who made that documentary, just flat out deceived the audience because they were rooting for Stephen Avery, viciously so. And so what they were doing was, in a sense, they were picking their narrative and pushing out everything else that didn't fit with it. And now the dumb thing about that is, even if they hadn't done that, there still would have been a pretty compelling story there. There still would be reason to question a lot of the things that went on there. You could still even make a case that, the cops did something wrong and stuff, if they hadn't done all these various things where they distorted the facts that were going on. And so later, when my wife and I watched the second season of it, we knew about this, And so they're making all these supposedly bombshell allegations and things like that in the second season, and we're just like, well, maybe, but we just don't believe you anymore because we know you lied to us in the first season. Another example of this is a couple of weeks back, I watched a documentary called Missing 411, and that's based off a book series a guy has written, which is about a large number of people who've apparently gone missing and were never found or heard from again in national parks and national forests and things along those lines. And supposedly what this guy did is he did a bunch of research, he compiled data of all missing persons reports from national parks, national forests, government lands, those kind of things, and he tried to look for patterns and commonalities. And what the documentary hints at, and I think his books get into in greater detail, is he says there's a lot of things that are about this that are very mysterious, where, say, people do bizarre things like instead of walking down the mountain, they suddenly turn around and apparently walk back up. Or somebody's walking behind a group of 3 or 4 other people, and then they turn around and that person's gone, and they're never seen again, and searchers go out for weeks, scour the area, nothing's seen, and then the person's body's found like 3 years later in an area the searchers already covered. Weird things like that. At least that's the contention of the documentary and the book series. Well, I did a little research again on this because after I watch things, I just love to look up more information about them. And this guy who wrote the book, at least in the book series, deliberately left out certain details that would have cast doubt on some of those disappearances. Like he included as a disappearance a case where it's well known that the person killed themselves, their body was found later, and it was determined that. Another case where the person was certainly abducted by a human being because they know there was a lot of evidence of that, and a few other examples like that. So what the author of this book series did is he either deliberately or because he just couldn't see it, excluded details that actually would cast doubt on the narrative he was presenting. And again, the thing that's dumb about the fact that he did it is, once you see that, it casts doubt on his whole narrative, because now you're like, well, I know he wasn't straight up, I know he didn't give me all the facts in these cases, what about the other cases? How do I know I'm getting the good information from him? And the reason why I look at that and think, well, that's just dumb, is the cases that he presented in the documentary, if they were even mostly true, while they're compelling enough that it should make you raise some questions anyway. There's an example of a poor little boy who went missing in a national forest, and they found some parts of his body and his clothes later, and the official explanation is that he was killed by a mountain lion, when the evidence doesn't fit with that. There were no marks on his clothing consistent with the way a mountain lion attacks people. And so I look at that and I think, well, that should make you start raising some questions. Maybe think about this. Maybe give you some evidence that might point you in the direction of the narrative this guy wants to present, that something mysterious is going on. But the fact that he excluded all those details then casts doubt on everything. There's a legal phrase called fruit of the poisonous tree. And what that means is, if the cops are coming to get you and they break into your house illegally and then seize evidence against you that you did something illegally, well, that evidence shouldn't be able to be used against you in court because the cops broke the law to get it. And these examples I'm citing are kind of like that. Once you know that there's some poisonous fruit somewhere in the chain of evidence, in the presentation you're getting, in the narrative you're hearing, that casts doubt on the whole thing, and it becomes harder to take it all seriously. So, now, how does all this tie together? Well, I'm doing this episode on narrative bias because I got asked to do something about the Covington High School teenagers who had that run-in with, what was his name, Nathan Phillips and the Black Hebrew Israelites at the end of the pro-life march in Washington, D.C. Oh, it's about 2 weeks ago, now a week and a half, I'm not quite sure. Anyhow, the details of this are all over the internet, and it's very easy to look it up and see what happened, but loosely speaking, a video got released that showed Nathan Phillips standing there beating his drum, and he's an older Native American guy, and he was beating his drum in front of a group of Catholic high school students who were standing there wearing President Trump's hats, and one of them was smiling at him. Then Nathan Phillips went and told the Washington Post that they all swarmed around him, he felt threatened, and he didn't know what to do, and suddenly, and they were making racist comments and things like that. And naturally speaking, everybody went ballistic and accused them all these students of being racist and everything like that. Well, a day or two later, video of the whole event gets released rather than just that segment, and you realize that Phillips flat out lied about what happened. He walked up and approached the Covington High School students and was beating the drum while he was standing there in front of them, and they were looking at him and he was looking at them, and one of the kids smiled. Some people say he smirked. It's a little, I don't know, maybe he did. And at the same time, right before this, a pretty awful group of people called the Black Hebrew Israelites were hurling epithets and saying very racist, awful things at these high school students. Now, some people who have watched the videos still say they think the high school students were doing some inappropriate things, like maybe they were mocking Phillips or something along those lines. And maybe so. I'm not going to try and weigh in too heavily on that, because that's not the point here. The point that I'm looking at here is, well, how did it happen that what was initially reported was so drastically different from what actually happened? Because what was initially reported is these racist high school students who happened to go to a Catholic university and be at the pro-life rally were being awful to a Native American guy, when that's obviously not what happened. You can look at the video and know that's not what happened. I think it'd be fair to say maybe they could have behaved better. I mean, they're high school kids. They're not going to behave perfectly. I didn't behave perfectly in high school, and I don't think anybody did. But the narrative that was initially reported, which is they swarmed around Phillips and were mocking him and being threatening, is absolutely not true. So why did that get reported? Well, what I want to suggest is that a lot of the people who were involved in reporting that have a narrative bias where they want to find something wrong with people who are from a Catholic high school because they don't like anything that's in any way associated with Christianity, especially Catholicism, because it tends to be more theologically conservative than some other more liberal brands of Christianity that they don't mind. And the fact that they were at a pro-life rally had a lot to do with it as well. They were going out looking for some excuse to find something wrong with something somebody did there to try and cast aspersions on the pro-life movement and pro-life ideals. And so when they found something that seemed to fit their narrative, they razor-focused in on that. That's all they could see. And that's why they reported it. They didn't see the guerrilla going on, which was the fact that Phillips lied, the fact that he approached them, the fact that the Black Hebrew Israelites were there being awful people, because they were so focused on seeing what they wanted to see. And that's what narrative bias is. It's when you get so focused on seeing the narrative that you want that you don't see the other facts around that could mitigate that a little bit. And we can all suffer from that. I mean, obviously the media suffers from it horribly, especially in this case. But all of us can see that. That's one of the reasons why I started with examples of fake stories from New Testament scholarship that I got taken in by, because that shows that I got taken in by it too. So, just a good way to help check this kind of thing and avoid narrative bias is, let's say you think that there's no possible way any reasonable person could disagree with you on a certain issue. Well, if you think that, it's pretty likely that you might suffer from narrative bias in that issue. Now, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying it could be the case that there might be odd or mitigating factors that you're not aware of. So, since this happened at a pro-life rally, and the preview little meme I put out yesterday was about abortion, let me just go ahead and use abortion as an example. I think the extreme pro-choice side definitely suffers from some very big narrative bias here. And the easy example of that, in reference to the picture I put out on the Facebook page yesterday, is there is ample scientific and philosophical evidence that the fetus or baby in the womb is a human being. If you don't believe me, go look it up. Go read a scientific textbook on human fetal development or something similar to that. I'm not suggesting you go read books that argue about abortion if you want to get the scientific facts about this. I'm suggesting you go read the actual scientific textbooks. Then go read some philosophical discussions about beginning of life and when life begins and things along those lines. There is no argument that can be given that makes the fetus, the baby in the womb, a non-human that cannot be used to also make somebody else a non-human. They'll try and tie it to consciousness. Well, does that mean a person who's in a coma is no longer a human being? Well, you wouldn't want to say that. They might try and tie it to development. Well, if that was the case, it would make somebody who's 85 and very wise more of a human being than it would make me, who's 36 and, well, hopefully I'm a little wise, but I'm certainly not as wise as I could be. They might try and tie it to potential and say it's only a potential human being, which is patently ridiculous because we all have immense potential all the time. Listen to my next segment where I talk about Aristotle's unmoved mover argument for God, and I'll talk about that a little more there. The point I'm making here is there is no evidence and no good reasons to think that a baby in the mother's womb is not a human being. It is. The only reason you would think that differently is if you want to support abortion. And so when pro-choice people deny that, they're suffering from narrative bias. But now let me give another example that might turn a few people off. There are some people who will claim that abortion is never justifiable in any circumstance, no matter what. And the reason they'll claim that is they say, well, the baby, the fetus, it's a human being. Now, the only way you can actually maintain that consistently is if you maintain that it's never justifiable to take another human life. And so you'd have to claim that if somebody broke into your house and was trying to kill you and kill your family, hurt you, all do horrible things to you, you're not justified in taking that person's life to defend your family. A soldier's never justified in taking the lives of enemy soldiers in war, and so on and so forth. Now, most people would say, well, taking a life is never a good thing, but there are situations where it's justifiable, where it's not wrong that you did that. So I would want to say, somebody breaks into my house, wants to hurt my wife or my kids, and the only way I can stop him is to kill him. I'm justified in doing that. Not a good thing, not something that we should run around celebrating that I would have to do that, but it was the right thing for me to do in that circumstance if I had to. So, if it is the case that you can sometimes, in some limited circumstances, be justified in taking a human life, and the fetus or baby in the womb is a human life, why is it not the case that you can't sometimes be justified in taking that human life? Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm extremely pro-life. Abortion is a horrible evil on our country. It's vile that this is going on, and if I knew a way to stop it, I would. What I'm saying is 99, maybe 97%, I don't recall the exact statistics, 97 to 99% of abortions are completely unjustifiable and they're just flat out murder for convenience. There's no doubt about that. But there's a very, very small number of cases where it might be justifiable. At least it's a little ethically and morally gray. Easy example of this is, let's suppose a mom gets cancer and she's going to die and she's pregnant. Well, if she gets treatment, she might survive. But the treatment, the chemotherapy, will kill the unborn baby. Now, if she doesn't get treatment, she's going to die and her baby will die because she doesn't have time to carry it to term without getting the treatment. So what do? Well, that's a very difficult question, and I've heard of some mothers in that situation who forego chemotherapy just to give their babies a chance for life, and that's very brave and commendable of them. But what I'm arguing here is that's a ethically gray situation. It's dicey. It's a little bit like when there's a combat medic on a battlefield and two people are injured and he has to treat one. There isn't time to treat two. He has to pick one, and one of them's going to die if he picks one. If he doesn't do anything, they're both going to die. Now, in situations like that, maybe abortion could be justified. It certainly wouldn't be, in any sense, a good thing. It's not something that people should be shouting about and screaming about how wonderful it is, like so many people are, because it's the ending of a human life. But in some odd and unusual situations, the ending of a human life might be the only good option, or the lesser of two evil options, like in the example of the combat medic or the woman who's got cancer while she's pregnant. So what I would want to say to pro-life people who say abortion's murder 100% of the time, full stop, is I think you're probably suffering from a little bit of narrative bias there, where you've let your understandable and to a large extent justifiable hatred of this evil that's abortion blind you to some other facts that are going on which may be relevant. And again, I feel the need to reiterate, I'm very pro-life. Abortion's evil. If there's any way we could do away with it, I'm all behind that. It's a horrible evil stain in our country, and it's caused not just moral problems, but it's also caused a lot of sociological problems. Easy example is we now have so much debt in this country that we don't know what to do with it. Well, imagine if the 45 million babies who have been aborted actually had been born and were now working and paying taxes. Maybe the government could actually fund everything it's trying to do. Just a thought. So that's what narrative bias is. It's where you get so focused on your own story, on seeing what you want to see, that you don't see any mitigating facts at all. You don't see anything that makes you go, I should consider that. The great philosopher Aristotle once said that it's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it. Meaning that if you're a pro-choice person, you can think about, well, what would it mean if the fetus really is a human being? Or if you're at the extreme pro-life side, you can think, well, what would it look like if there actually were some gray areas where it's not clear whether the abortion's justified or not? Well, that's a good thing, and that's what I'm trying to push you toward, because that's what's going to get you out of narrative bias when you're able to look around and stop focusing on your own narrative so much and widen your gaze a little bit. It's very difficult to do, and the easiest way to do it is just read people who are going to tell you you're wrong. Go read their books and see what they have to say. When I finished getting my master's in philosophy, I went and listened to audiobooks by Sam Harris and the late Victor Stinger, who were both arguing that everything I believe is wrong. And I was very unimpressed by their arguments. They were remarkably bad. I couldn't believe anybody took them seriously. But what I was trying to do there is, in a certain sense, say, well, does the other side have anything good to say? And in that particular case, it turned out they didn't. But if you've at least tried that, you're probably not suffering from narrative bias. So when the media had been reporting on the event that happened to those Covington high school students, if they'd at least tried to see, well, is there something else going on here? Does the other side have something to say? They probably wouldn't have got it so horrifically wrong. So I've decided to start doing a new segment here at the end of the show where I'm going to talk about arguments for the existence of God for just a few minutes here. And what I'll do is just go through a philosophical argument that somebody gave for God, talk about what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, where it came from, and so forth. And the reason I'm doing this is because, well, I love doing philosophy of religion, and I particularly enjoy engaging with arguments for the existence of God. They're obviously important in the sense that it really does matter a great deal whether or not God exists. If God doesn't exist, that should have profound implications on how you live your life, and if he does exist, that should have profound implications on how you live your life. And on top of that, there's so many arguments for the existence of God and so many variations of them that it's pretty hard to even list them all. In fact, if I did this show for the next 20 years and did this segment every week, I probably couldn't even begin to exhaust all the arguments that various philosophers have given for the existence of God. Now, since this is the first time I'm doing this segment, I'm going to explain a little bit about how arguments for God's existence are categorized. Immanuel Kant, who's regarded as the great German idealist philosopher, and most philosophy nowadays kind of takes after Kant, he classified the arguments for God into three categories. He said, quote, "The first proof is the psycho-teleological, the second the cosmological, And the third, the ontological proof. There are no more of them, and there also cannot be any more. Now, if you study philosophy at all, you're probably never ever going to hear anybody else say this about Immanuel Kant in any context, but here he has grossly oversimplified the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. There are a whole lot more, and there can be a whole lot more. Now, if we interpret Kant a little charitably, what he might be getting at is there's three families of arguments for the existence of God. That is, there's teleological arguments. Those are arguments like, say, the fine-tuning of the universe. You've probably heard about that before. But it's essentially that the physics and things along those lines in the world and the universe are very well tuned for human life. Therefore, there must be somebody who tuned them, therefore God. And a simple, easy example of that is the distance the Earth is from the Sun. The Earth is a precise distance from the Sun. If it was a little bit further away, we'd be way too cold and human life couldn't exist. If it was a little bit closer, it'd be way too hot and we'd all burn up and die. So those are teleological arguments. I don't recall off the top of my head why he called them the psycho-teleological, but he meant teleological. Now, the second family could consider would be cosmological argument. And the term should give you a clue as to what it's about. Cosmos, i.e. the universe. And it's about looking at the universe and trying to figure out, well, where did it all come from? These tend to be a bit more metaphysical, that is, going beyond physics, where the teleological ones will be more appealing to physics. And so a quick, easy example of this is nothing comes from nothing. Every time there is something, it had to come from something else. So, the universe is something. It is here. We can interact with it. It's something. Therefore, it had to come from something else. And then the best candidate for what that something else is God. And that's a very loose one. There's a whole lot better ones. So, for example, there's the popular Kalam cosmological argument that the Christian philosopher William Lane Craig champions. There's another one that some philosophers like a little bit better, called the Leibnizian cosmological argument that Gottfried Leibniz gave. And I think I like that one a little better too. And there's all kinds of other various cosmological arguments. The point of all these is that you're trying to look at the universe, the cosmos as a whole, and say, well, what explanations are there for it? Do they require explanations? And that's what cosmological arguments are. Now, the ontological proof, as Kant says, or ontological argument, is a whole different beast altogether, in that what it attempts to do is show from the very concept of God that God must exist. And a very loose and poor version of that is to say, well, God is a necessary being. A necessary being, by definition, exists. Therefore, God exists. Now, that's an ontological argument. It's a very, very bad one, because it's just defining things into existence. But there are ontological arguments that maybe don't define things into existence, that actually seem to possibly work. At the very least, I can tell you that it is the case that there are ontological arguments that are logically valid. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they work. An argument can be logically valid and still be wrong. But being logically valid isn't nothing. Now, it's probably unwise to think of any of these arguments as arguments in the singular, and like I said, think of them as families of arguments. There's all kinds of variations of the teleological argument. Some of them aren't even just appealing to fine-tuning. There's all kinds of variations of the cosmological argument, and some of those appeal to some odd things as well. And there's several different variants of the ontological argument. The most popular distinction is there's one that St. Anselm gave, that was the first one, and now there are modal versions that are given here in contemporary society. Those started with Alvin Plantinga, but several other people have given modal ontological arguments as well, like Robert Maydell. So what I'm going to do in this segment here is just find an argument for, a philosophical argument for God that some philosopher gave. I'll do my best to explain the argument to you, talk to you about it a little bit, and classify it as into which of those three categories it belongs, or if it is in its own category. And my goal here is you listen to 20 or 30 of these, you might come to realize, well, it can be rational and logical to believe in the existence of God. Not just because there's so many arguments, but because some of them actually do work. Some of them are pretty good arguments. So, to start off this segment, I'm going to go all the way back to Aristotle. He gave what is quite possibly one of the first cosmological arguments for the existence of God. Now, it's possible that there were philosophers who gave cosmological arguments before Aristotle, but his unmoved mover argument generally gets regarded as kind of the granddaddy of it all. It's a little bit like how Socrates is regarded as the father of philosophy, even though there were philosophers before him. Now, Aristotle gives his argument for the unmoved mover in both physics and metaphysics, although the argument is referenced as being, he gives it in his book, Metaphysics. You have to read the physics book to understand what he's saying in metaphysics. Now, Aristotle's book Metaphysics is where we actually get the term metaphysics from, and there it just meant after physics. It came after his book on physics. Now, you probably already know what physics means. It's the study of the physical world. Well, metaphysics in this broad philosophical sense is whatever it is that's above physics. So like the laws of logic, if they are above physics, if physics adhere to them, would be metaphysical laws. Now, Aristotle seems to think that the principle of motion is something that's metaphysical like that, and that's what he uses to go about making his unmoved mover argument. Now, it's important to understand here that when Aristotle used the term motion, he meant it in a broader sense than we do today. Typically, when you hear that word now, what you think it means is, well, something's moving. The car's in motion because it's moving down the road. I'm in motion if I'm walking. I'm kind of partially in motion now because I'm waving my hand while I talk. I like to talk with my hands when I'm doing this kind of stuff. But Aristotle understood motion not just to mean movement, but also change. That is, he would say, a tree that falls over and decays is in motion as it's decaying. And so in that broad sense, pretty much everything is in motion because everything is either moving or changing. Now, he defined motion in his book Physics as, quote, the fulfillment of what exists potentially insofar as it exists potentially. Further, according to him, there are 3 types of motion and 5 things that are necessary for motion to occur. That is, there's qualitative, quantitative, and local or locomotion. Those are the 5 kinds. By this he means is that, well, a thing may change. That is, I can gain and lose qualities. So I have a full head of hair. Maybe one day I won't. That's a change. The amount of a thing may change. So the U.S. Army has a certain number of people in it right now. I don't know how many. But that's going to change tomorrow. They're going to recruit some people, and some other people are going to leave. And the location of a thing can change. I could change my location. I could get up out of this chair right now and walk somewhere else, maybe to go get a cup of coffee or something. Now, obviously, there will be some types of change that are only available to some types of things. Just an easy example, I can't increase or decrease my quantity. There is only one Phil, and as long as I'm alive, there's only going to be one of me. Now, for motion to occur, there are 5 distinct things that are needed. First, there needs to be something that pushes the object into motion. So if the ball's going to move, you need to push it. Then there must be the thing that is pushed, or that which is in motion. That is, the ball has to be there if you're going to push it. There must be time in which the motion is occurring. So time has to pass for motion to occur. If there's no time, motion's not going to occur. And there must be a place or location from which the ball was pushed. The ball has to have a starting location. And then there must be a place or location toward which it is being pushed. That is the end goal. There has to be somewhere for it to go. If you take any one of those 5 things away, then there is no motion. Aristotle tied his definitions of time and his definition of motion together, as he said that time is a measurement of motion, and he defined time as a moment that always separates the future and the past. According to him, time is a moment that has a before and an after. So, according to him, the universe was eternal because time always must have a before moment, so there must always be something before. Now, according to Aristotle, that meant the past is eternal, that is, it goes on forever, because, obviously, if every moment has a part that's before, then there always will be something that's before. So now you're probably thinking, well, great, but how does all this prove the existence of God? Well, stop and think about it here for a moment. If everything that's in motion, and by Aristotle's definition of motion, has to be pushed by something else, then where does it start? And that's the whole crux of his argument there. Loosely speaking, we could say that you were put in motion by your parents when they got together. They were put in motion by their parents, and so on and so on and so on, back onto Well, whenever humanity originated. Then something had to originate humanity. And here it doesn't even matter whether you're claiming it was God doing it directly or whether humankind arose through evolutionary processes. Something had to originate humanity. Then something had to originate that thing, and so on and so forth. So eventually what Aristotle said is you have to arrive at an unmoved mover. That is, something that pushes the first ball, but is not itself pushed by anything. And the reason he said this is that he thought you cannot have an infinite regress. Things can't just go back on forever. There has to be an originating cause. And later on, some philosophers and cosmological arguments gave, I'd say, better and more explicit reasons why you can't have an infinite regress like that, so maybe I'll cover that later. But that's his whole point, is that there must be something which doesn't have any potential. It only is actual. And you'll probably need to understand those terms a little bit more philosophically. Now, potentially, we're all very, very many different things. We all have potentials, both good and bad. I have the potential to get up and walk out of my chair and go get a cup of coffee. I have the potential to better myself and be a better man. I have the potential to be a worse man. And you've got a lot of potentials, too. And part of the key that Aristotle's getting at here when he talks about movement is that in order to realize those potentials, things have to be acted upon by an outside force. So the rock has a potential to roll down the hill, but it's not going to do that unless somebody pushes it over, there's an earthquake, and so on and so forth. And so he kind of extrapolates from all that and says, well, there's all these potential things that have been moved by other things and where that potential was made actual. That is, the rock actually rolled down the hill, but before it did, it had the potential. So where did that come from? Where does it originate? And that's Aristotle's unmoved mover, loosely and roughly speaking. If you go read Physics and Metaphysics, he goes into much more detail than that, but that's his point is, essentially, everything must come from something. So if we trace the causation back far enough, there must be the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. And just loosely, the reason why you can't have an infinite regress is that if there was nothing at the beginning, then the cause would have never got here. So, example I've heard of this is, let's say you want to borrow a book from a friend who's going to get that book from another friend, who's going to borrow that book from another friend, and so on back ad infinitum. Well, in order for you to actually get that book, there has to be somebody somewhere along that chain who actually had the book and started passing it up the chain. And it's the same thing with potentiality, actuality, Aristotle's unmoved mover. In order for us to get where we are, in order for me to be sitting here talking to you, in order for me to be actualizing that potential, there has to be an unmoved mover somewhere back in the past chain of events. Now, I've read many people who claim that Aristotle accidentally found or proved the existence of God with a capital G, the Christian God, in Physics and Metaphysics, and that's because his unmoved mover does seem to share many characteristics with the Orthodox understanding of the Christian God. But I've also read some people claiming the opposite. Now, it seems to me that Aristotle did prove that there must be an unmoved mover, and while that is certainly enough to disprove like a strong sense of atheism, it's a far cry from establishing the God of Christianity. That is, if Aristotle's unmoved mover is correct, then it's not the case that there is nothing that's a deity or like a deity, but it may turn out to be that Aristotle's unmoved mover is not the God of Christianity. Now, it's certainly a step in the Christian God's direction, as there are times when God seems to describe himself in ways that are quite a bit like an unmoved mover. He told Moses, I am that I am. I am my own existence. I am my own potential. I am my own actuality. And that's awfully similar to an unmoved mover. Further, Aristotle's unmoved mover is changeless, eternal, one, and that means indivisible in the simple sense of being without parts, necessary, without magnitude, and what Aristotle means by magnitude is that his unmoved mover has no size, shape, or location. So if you take all those attributes and simply throw in personal, then you'd have a description that's pretty analogous to the way the Bible describes God. So what I conclude here is that Aristotle's unmoved mover is God, with a capital G, but kind of the same sense that an American is Phil Kahlberg. And so Phil Kahlberg is an American. That is, I'm a citizen of the United States. However, I have a great many more characteristics and properties than simply being an American. You could know that I'm an American, but still not know an awful lot about me. But if you wanted to look at it this way, which seems kind of backwards, establishing that there are such things as Americans could be a step toward knowing who and what Phil Kahlberg is. Likewise, Aristotle's unmoved mover is a step toward knowing God, and I think it's enough to disprove atheism, at least most variants of it. Platonists might still be able to find a way around this, but most of them won't. But that it doesn't get us all the way to knowing the God of Christianity. Now, additionally, I do want to point out that I do think it's kind of odd how dramatically different Aristotle's description of the gods is from the typical Greek gods. Greek gods were anything but perfect and were certainly interested in a lot more things than themselves, whereas the god or gods Aristotle describes are so high and self-contained that it's difficult to see how they could take any interest in anything else. And this is as opposed to the Christian God, who takes a great deal of interest in humans and other things. Now, it's also worth noting that Aristotle's unmoved mover may be unmoved movers, as depending on how you read the texts, it's a little unclear whether he thinks there's 1 or 47 or 55 unmoved movers. He ties his idea of what the unmoved mover is to astronomy, and at the time the Greek astronomers kind of had an idea of how many celestial objects there were, and that's where he's possibly getting the number from. And a final distinction here is that because Aristotle thought that the unmoved mover was pure actuality without potentiality, that is, it had no potential to change, it's unmoved, it can't change, so it has no potential, he thought that it was perfect, because that in his mind that would be the perfect thing, would be something with no potential that's actualized all possibilities. So he also thought that because it was perfect, it didn't think about anything but itself. It spent all its time contemplating the most perfect thing, itself contemplating itself. That is, Aristotle's unmoved mover does nothing but think about itself, thinking about itself, because that, according to Aristotle, is what is perfect. Now, there's a very obvious difference, as I just said, between that and the Christian God. And I think here Aristotle was working from a poor understanding of perfection, as it seems to me that considering things that are other than yourself, and even those things that are lesser than yourself, is not a sign of imperfection. I would actually argue that it's greater to consider things of yourself. You're better if you do consider things that are other and lesser than yourself. Just easy example of this, I sometimes will consider the feelings and needs of my dog. Now, my dog is plainly a lesser creature than myself, as it's a dog, but it doesn't make me less perfect if I consider my dog's needs and feelings. In fact, it seems to me that it makes me more perfect. The Phil that considers the needs and wants of his dog is better than the Phil that just ignores his dog. And I think generally pretty much most people would agree that a person who's just indifferent to the needs and feelings of animals is in some way morally inferior to a person who actually cares for animals. There's something good about considering the other, and Aristotle's understanding of perfection, and hence his unmoved mover, seems to lack that. So, loosely speaking, that's Aristotle's unmoved mover argument. The cosmological arguments actually get better and easier to understand than that. His argument is very dependent on certain understandings of metaphysics and terms and things along those lines, and it kind of requires you to think in a way you're probably not used to thinking. But the best explanation of it is that book example. If you're going to borrow a book from a friend who's going to borrow it from another friend who's going to borrow it from another friend and so on and so forth, at some point in a chain going back to infinity of people borrowing books, there has to be someone with an actual book for the chain to get started. So if you have the book, you know somebody at the start had the book. So extrapolate that into what I said about potentiality and actuality. You're actualizing all kinds of potentials in your life right now. You could potentially listen to the rest of this program or shut it off. You could potentially get a cup of coffee like I want to do. You could potentially do all kinds of things. You're actualizing that. So if Aristotle's right in that principle he's talking about, what that means is, at some point way back when, someone or something started that process of actualizing potentials. And that's Aristotle's unmoved mover. All right, now, end of the program, so it's time to tell me what you think. what do you think about narrative bias? Did you like my examples? Can you think of some examples of your own? Do you think that there are no gray areas in abortion, that it's always one way or always the other way? What do you think about Aristotle's unmoved mover argument for the existence of God? Do you find it a good argument, a compelling one, or something not? Write in and tell me what you think. You can reach me for comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, and I started a Facebook group called The Examined Life with Phil, and you can leave comments there. It's always welcome. And, if you have any ideas or suggestions for more Facepalm and Sigh Awards of the Week, send those to me as well. And as always, I'm open to topics that you'd like to hear me explore. So write in, let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you all again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.